Whilst we experience a host of emotions, what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on just two of them, anger and happiness, and we're going to kind of talk about some of the research into how those emotions are experienced in our daily lives. So we'll start with the two dimensions of any emotion that we experience. We have the dimension of valence, which is how positive or negative an emotion is. If you think about all the different emotions you feel over the course of the day, some of them are ones that you want to feel because they're positive, whether it's happiness or excitement or surprise or contentment. We have positive emotions, and then some of them are the ones that you'd rather not experience. You feel sadness, you feel fear, you feel anger. So valence talks about how positive or negative a feeling is. And then every emotion also has a different level of arousal. Whether it's a low versus high arousal. There's a very big difference between feeling excited or feeling jubilant versus feeling content. And so these two dimensions can be used to plot in sort of a coordinate system, any one of our emotions. If you look here at this graph, you can see that something like excited is a positive emotion, so it's on the positive side in terms of valence, and it also involves really, really high arousal, versus something down here like relaxed, still positive valence, but now we're dealing with a low level of arousal. For every emotion we experience, we can kind of plot it along these two different coordinate systems and come up with where it would fall. So we're going to start with anger. There are two basic areas we're going to focus on. We're going to look at the causes and then maybe the consequences of anger. The causes, there's a whole broad range of triggers for why we'd feel angry, but there tend to be two categories that all of those different reasons fall into. Usually anger is created for one of two reasons. One, we feel like we've been wronged by someone else. Now, the someone else might be somewhat of a misnomer. A lot of times it's a person, but sometimes we get angry almost like at the world, like we feel we've been wronged by the world and dealt like an unfair hand. But a lot of times we feel angry because we feel that like we didn't receive what we thought we deserved to receive. And the second cause, and as we'll learn later, maybe the more dangerous cause, are going to be the daily hassles, little minor disturbances or annoyances, or like the little things that like they don't seem earth shattering, but they're enough to just kind of like flare our tempers up and get us a little bit angry. And those types of reactions can actually be the ones that take a really big hit on our health in later years. Because one of the consequences of being almost like chronically angry and chronically hostile and constantly reacting to those daily annoyances and those like little minor hassles is you are actually putting yourself at risk for heart disease. The more often you get worked up on a daily basis, the more likely it is that you're going to have some sort of cardiac event. In terms of how we deal with anger, boys and girls generally deal differently. Of course, we're talking in generalizations. So if you're a boy and you're looking at this list and you think like, ooh, I don't tend to like walk away from the situation in like a healthy coping manner. I like to talk it over with my friends. That's okay. We're just talking about averages here. But for people who are coping with their anger, and we're using the word coping, so this doesn't mean like giving into it and doing what maybe the anger says you want to. You're not giving into your id here. Boys have a tendency to do one of two things. What's making them angry, they'll just kind of like wash their hands of it and like walk away and just remove themselves from the situation, almost like ignore it. Boys will also maybe try to vent in a little way through exercise, maybe displace some of their anger into that type of active engagement. Girls tend to want to talk it out. They want to maybe discuss it with a friend first, talk about the situation. They also might engage in some introspective activities like listening to music or writing out their feelings. And in terms of exercising or writing your feelings or trying to vent your anger, the question is, does this actually work? Does releasing your anger in some way actually help us deal with it and cope with it? And in our type of culture, an individualistic culture, we tend to say yes, that like you shouldn't keep anger bottled up inside. We tend to say you shouldn't keep any emotions bottled up inside, and our display rules usually allow us to actually show those emotions to others. However, in some collectivist cultures, they definitely do not encourage this venting of anger. And our culture says, well, venting is good because it allows you to release. And we sort of presume catharsis. This idea that by letting our anger out, whether it's by screaming or yelling or crying or like punching a wall or like doing something, will allow us to feel an emotional release. And if we vent our anger, we reduce our anger. That's at least the presumption. However, what we find actually can happen is that might only end up being temporarily calming. If you retaliate in anger, there are a couple of key things you have to keep in mind. Retaliation can only work if you're actually venting like towards whoever provoked the anger in the first place. And a lot of times we don't do that. We get upset at like a boss or at a teacher, but we don't vent with them. We go home and we like vent to a friend, or we like write angry things in our journal. And so we need to direct it towards the provoker. And I'm not saying that's a good idea, but I'm saying if you want to reduce your anger, like that's one of the things that usually has to happen. Your anger needs to seem justified and your retaliation needs to seem justified, and the target can't be too intimidating. But it's only calming sometimes. The problem is that a lot of times expressing anger leads to more anger. And this we already learned in terms of facial feedback and behavioral feedback. Sometimes by giving into our anger and expressing it, that causes us to behave in an angry way. And then our body gives a message to our mind that we're still angry. And so our anger can actually become magnified. There's been some experimental support for the idea that if like you give someone a punching bag to like work out their anger, it can make them angrier. So catharsis doesn't seem to like always work. So the question is, how can we handle our anger? And the first answer is one that's sometimes really difficult to do. But the best thing you can do is just wait it out. We know now that emotion is comprised of three very important components, one of which is physiological arousal. And the good news is if you allow your body time to calm itself down, that physiological arousal will stop contributing to your emotion. And if you remove physiological arousal from the equation, sometimes the emotion itself can dissipate. So the whole idea of like counting to 10 or going into another room, that's a really good idea. Another possibility is to find yourself an outlet, but one that doesn't involve actually like ruminating on what's making you angry. Rumination is when you kind of just cycle through things over and over and over in your head, and you kind of like hang on to an idea and you can't let it go. And so if you can find an activity that distracts you, that can be a good idea. So it can be exercise as long as you're not like angry exercising. It can be listening to music. It could be just like chatting with a friend, but finding an outlet that doesn't have you just rehashing the thing that made you angry in the first place. Okay, so we have anger on one side. That's sort of if we're dealing with like a negative valence emotion. But then we want to do a positive valence one too. So we'll do happiness. This slide, a little bit intimidating, I can see a whole lot of words, but one of the first key findings about happiness is that it is really intrinsically linked to your worldview and the way that you interpret situations around you. Happy people have a tendency to, we'll just run through some of these, see the world as like a safer, more predictable place. Happy people tend to be more tolerant of others' differences. Happy people tend to be able to like replay memories without dwelling on maybe uncomfortable past moments. Versus unhappy people who have a tendency to feel that their life is meaningless, who tend to show lower levels of creativity, who tend to show less energy. Some of those findings are the reason why workplaces nowadays are trying so hard to take care of the holistic person. You have employers who now provide definitely childcare in-house, who have like yummy food located on every floor where you can like get yourself free coffee and you can build yourself like delicious lunch. They have gyms right there, like where you are. They offer, a lot of places actually have religious ministers like on campus that you can go talk to. And the reason behind that, you want to say it's altruistic, that they just want to be nice, but some of it also is linked to productivity. When you're happy, you tend to be more creative. You tend to have more energy. You tend to be more productive. And so employers are aware of this now, and they're trying to implement that in the workplace. Happiness also can predict some outcomes. They did a study where they looked at a yearbook of women during the 1950s, and they identified which women seemed to be smiling with genuine smiles. We learned about Feign versus Duchenne smiles just a little bit ago. So women who like those eye muscles were activated. And they found that women who were smiling genuine smiles tend to be married in middle age. Another study found that happiness was correlated with how much money people were making. And so happiness seems to be able to predict social success as well as financial success, which is kind of interesting. Um, and we've also found that when people are happy and when they're in a good mood, they tend to be more generous. And this is a good thing to be aware of if you ever have to do fundraising or if you have to ask people to help you do something. Make sure they're in a good mood first. This is why charities will throw those really like expensive, lavish parties when they're asking for donations. I assume some of you have wondered before, why are you doing that? Just take the money you're spending on the party and put it towards the charity. Well, the reason they're doing that is because they know they'll actually end up making more money by making people go like feel good and have them go to the party and feel special and put them in a great mood. Maybe also lower some of their inhibitions with alcohol if we're dealing with an over 21 crowd. They're trying usually to bank on this feel good, do good phenomenon that people have a tendency to be helpful when they're already in a good mood. Now, one of the little bits of research about happiness that I find really interesting has to do with how long can we expect to stay happy versus when we feel sad. And there's really good news in a lot of this research on, how do we tend to progress through our emotions, that we tend to level out over time. Research done by Adam Kramer looked at Facebook statuses. This was done a couple years ago. I know Facebook isn't the thing the kiddies use nowadays, but he found that there is a little bit of an ebb and flow to our emotions for sure. He tracked emotion words that were used in Facebook status updates, and he found that the happiest days were the days close approaching the weekend and on the weekend, so Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and the least happy days, Wednesday was definitely up there. But the good news is that people tend to just go through a cycle, and it's almost a predictable cycle. And so you can't really expect to have to stay in a really, really bad mood for too long. Watson and Kahneman did a study where they looked at people's moods hour by hour. They had people hooked up to like devices where it would buzz them and they'd report in their mood just very quickly, like through a pager or through a phone. And they found that emotion tends to cycle like any circadian rhythm does. That for most people, our positive emotions rise over the early to middle part of most days. Then there tends to be like a little bit of a leveling off. Think of even like siesta time when everything about you tends to like depress a little bit. And that any negative emotions that people were feeling that day actually tend to disappear by the next day. And so they also found that sometimes if you're feeling really bad on like Monday, when you woke up Tuesday, you might rebound to an even better than normal mood. And this is an average sample. And this is also why if you're hearing this and you're thinking, that's not the case for me. I seem to always be struggling with feeling sad and like I never ever seem happy. Well, maybe that's a sign that you should talk to someone and that maybe we're dealing with something that's not just a normal everyday mood shift, but might be a symptom of something like clinical depression. So it's always worthwhile if you're feeling that maybe your emotions aren't cycling normally, talk to a professional about that because we definitely have them. And this here is just showing that idea of how positive emotions tend to like peak about 7 hours after you wake up and tend to then like drop back down. Just it's a graphic example or a graphical example of Watson and Kahneman's